Today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 21st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a primary election that occurred last evening in the state of Alaska. The state of Alaska holds their primaries in a very open primary. The top four contenders make it into a final ranked choice voting runoff election in the November election. And last night was the first true test of political power for the Democratic Party in a state like Alaska, a state that Donald Trump won in the last election by 10.1%. It's a double-digit Trump state, and in this recent primary last evening, the Democratic incumbent, Mary Peltola, who was sworn and elected into office in 2022, won 50.4% of the vote with every other contender in the race. Now, the United States House of Representatives elections in Alaska have been seen as a very big indicator of what we might expect this coming November. And a big reason for that was because back in 2022, there was a special election roughly around this time, on August 16th, that took place using ranked choice voting. They held their first primary earlier on after Don Young, the incumbent representative, unfortunately passed away, prompting this special election in the first place. And what we found was that around this time, Democrats were doing this, Alaska was doing this new ranked choice voting system. And so the first round primary results showed Mary Peltola, the Democrat, at just 39.7% of the vote. She was not as well known statewide, and she wasn't as highly approved as she is today. And she certainly, obviously, was not the electoral incumbent. And so the combined Republican vote share was very similar to what we've seen in Alaska in years past. In fact, outperforming and exceeding expectations for Republicans. In that first round of vote, Sarah Palin received 31% of the vote, Nick Begich received 28% of the vote. Combined, nearly 60% of the electorate voted for Republicans. But then came the final round. Then came Mary Peltola doing well in this race. And so what happened here was that she ended up with 39.7% in that first round. Combined vote share was 60%. But as the ballots started to get counted, we saw that in the final round, which was just tracked about 2 weeks later, it took a while for them to count the ballots because they had to wait for all the mail-ins. You can't do ranked choice voting until you receive every single ballot, 51.5% to 48.5%. Last night's special election was not ranked choice. It was an early indicator of what we might expect to see this November because it allowed us to see the electoral strength of Mary Peltola and the Republicans' combined vote share. But at face value, you know this. The Democratic Party already has exceeded the majority of the vote in the first primary, the open primary of this cycle in the state of Alaska. This is a state that, again, Trump won by double digits in the last election and in the House race. One of the first true tests of actual electoral strength for the Democratic Party, besides special elections, which we will get to in a moment and later down in this video, Mary Peltola exceeds expectations. Because, again, reminding ourselves, too, where was she back in that earlier on open primary? It actually wasn't even, better for Mary Peltola. She came in fourth place in the multi-way race against all of these candidates. Everybody wanted to throw their hat in the ring. And Mary Peltola ended up with 10% of the vote. 1 in 10 voters chose her in the early stages. By the end of the election, the majority chose her. In a very short period of time, she took an advantage over Sarah Palin. That was a 3-point victory. 3 points. Keep this in mind. And then translated it to, in 2022, just 3 months later in the November election, to a 10-point victory. In the earlier stages of that first round, received 48.8% of the vote. The combined Republican vote share there was still strong enough to say that Republicans would have a very good shot at winning that election. And yet, Mary Peltola exceeded expectations, not only got to the majority, but won by 10 points. This time around, voters in Alaska don't even seem to be considering others. They are now considering Mary Peltola as their presumptive winner in this coming November election. Because remember, she went from 10 points in that special to winning the election. And then she went from 48.8 in the actual election to winning that election. Can you imagine when her starting point is at 50.4%? And because Alaska has no contentious primaries besides this one, this is not a state with partisan primaries. That's why it is an open primary and ranked choice voting by the time we reach November. That is a huge benefit for the Democratic Party because Mary Peltola, that is the only way she was able to get through. And so now that we're seeing here Mary Peltola as the incumbent representative, I can't help but think that this Alaska primary result is something that we definitely can use, for some level at least, of national implications. Because what I remember very often about the 2022 midterms, and it's something that we even ignored leading into these House election results, is that a lot of what we saw on election night could actually have been predicted earlier on by special elections like the one in Alaska. And Alaska wasn't the only special election that had taken place in the 2022 midterms. If you take a look at what had happened in 2022, there was a significant amount of special elections that genuinely could have shown us that Democrats were on track for a far better performance than what the polls, even the pundits and even people like me were telling you. Because it was really hard to see in a day and age where Republicans were outperforming the national popular vote by 8 points. But polls, in many cases, are noise. And actual election results are exactly that. They're not perfect indicators. If the special elections were, 1-to-1, the most perfect level of indication in comparison to any other metric, it would have said Democrats were in fact expanding their House majority. That was not the case. Democrats did not expand it. But it did reveal that the level of support for Democrats did not collapse, and in some cases did better in the wake of the Dobbs decision. And we did in fact see that in some of these districts, Democrats actually outperformed their 2020 margins, despite losing in some of these districts after redistricting. Point being, though, if you take a look at the special elections that were really good indicators, Texas's 34th was the only one where Republicans did well, and that was just a week before the Dobbs decision was released. Republicans flipped this seat, and Democrats had a combined vote share loss of roughly 3 points across the district. It was bad news for Democrats, but then when Roe v. Wade was overturned, everything changed, and we know that even through this election. And so when you take a look at the results from Nebraska's 1st, Minnesota's 1st, these are districts, both of these, that Trump won by double digits. Trump won Nebraska's 1st by 15 in the last election. Republicans won it by 5. In Minnesota's 1st, Trump won it by double digit. Brad Finstad won by 4. When you take a look at Alaska at large, Mary Peltola again went from being the underdog, 10% in that initial race, 39% in the first round, 52% in the final round. New York's 19th, Pat Ryan, Antonio Delgado was in a Trump district, Republican district. Cook PVI of R+3, Pat Ryan won. The reason being that in almost every example, also New York's 23rd, coincided with the New York 19th district. No money spent on the Democratic side in the 23rd district. No energy, no enthusiasm. When you even go to the page, the Democrat here doesn't even have a Wikipedia page because nobody even thought this race would be remotely competitive. It narrowed down to 6 points. And then there was a special election on Election Day. Point that being, though, all of those elections preceding the race in 2022, the actual midterm elections, showed Democrats doing far better than what the polls had predicted. And that's sort of where I'm trying to get at here. That Mary Peltola's performance is an indicator yet again of many of the ones we've seen this cycle that show Democrats in a better position than what people might be predicting, just based on the fact that Trump is in fact outperforming his 2020 numbers. But an outperformance does not always translate to swing state victories either. We remember back in 2022 that in the Senate level, Republicans might have won the national popular vote on the overall congressional ballot by 3 points nationwide. That's a victory that's impressive regardless, right? They won back House control, and you would expect in a circumstance like that. When Biden was winning the national popular vote by more, right, 4.5%, and 7-point swing from the 2020 election, that states like Wisconsin that were decided by 0.6 would become so much more conservative. States like Michigan that were decided by 2.8 would become Republican. States like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona that were decided by a point or less would move over to the Republican column. And yet in this case, only one of them actually did become more conservative, and it was Wisconsin, which shifted by 0.4%. Pennsylvania became 4 points more Democratic. Georgia, 2 points more Democratic. Arizona, 4 points more Democrat. Nevada shifted over to the right, but still, Democrats made a massive ability to just survive these midterm elections and, in fact, expand their Senate majority. And the only real indicator of this throughout this entire campaign season wasn't the polls. According to the polls, Herschel Walker was up, Dr. Oz was up, Blake Masters was up. Take a look at the Rookler Politics pages from these 3 states. Republicans led on them on Election Day. Even FiveThirtyEight had Dr. Oz up in Pennsylvania. He lost in these states. The polls were wrong. The so-called enthusiasm, too, and that's something that matters in a presidential. I don't really think it matters as much in a midterm. Not as much. It obviously is a factor. But still, metric after metric after metric, except the special elections, except the actual elections that were able to take place before November, that revealed the race was far more pro-Democrat than we might think. And so when you take a look at 2024, special elections out the wazoo, right? Looking at New York's 3rd, New York's 26th. These are special elections that didn't have as many high stakes, but Democrats already flipped a district. Tom Suozzi won back his seat in New York's 3rd district. He retired to run for governor, lost the governor's race, left Congress. Now he ran because George Santos was expelled, ran and won not only by a small margin, won by 8 points across this district. George Santos won the same district, same congressional boundaries, same everything by 8 points as well in 2022. So a 16-point swing in the span of a year. You're talking literally a year since inauguration. George Santos less than. The election was held a year and a month after that. When he was expelled, it was less than a year. Tom Suozzi won. New York's 26th, already safe district. Democrats expanded. And when you take a look at Ohio's 6th, another perfect example, a district that received no attention, the Democrat had less than $100,000. There was no money, no focus, no resources for the Democratic Party. Just take a look too. Professional headshot versus not. I mean, you know this election was very much hodgepodge for Democrats. And yet in the results, they gained 13 points across the district from the last election. Same congressional boundaries, same district, same voters, and sure, the turnout here wasn't great overall, but it was an indicator that in terms of who's turning out to vote, likelihood of the base turning out for the Democratic Party, it is there in these districts. It is there on the national level. And Alaska yet again reaffirms our point here and shows that Mary Peltola not only is giving good news for Democrats nationally, but really good news on a statewide level. Because it means that even if these Republicans combine and lock rank, if Nancy Dahlstrom was to drop out tomorrow and endorse Nick Begich, it would only get him to 47%, assuming all of those voters are going to him. Because what we also remember too from 2022 is that a lot of those voters out there that might be at initial glance saying, sure, I'll vote for the Republican no matter who it is, until they were faced with a hard decision. Sarah Palin and Nick Begich together could have easily beaten Mary Peltola. In fact, their combined vote share was already above where Mary Peltola was. But voters couldn't stomach Sarah Palin. And some of those voters for Nick Begich couldn't stomach him, for Sarah Palin, couldn't stomach Nick Begich either. Sarah Palin herself all but said that she ranked Mary Peltola second when she was running against and alongside another Republican. The Alaska results here are indicators Democrats are in a much stronger place than I think we otherwise see. In the national polls that show Kamala Harris up by 3, it's difficult, I think, if you're looking back at it from the 2020 lens and perspective, when Biden was leading by 7, 8 points nationally, to genuinely see this election as anything but far closer. And while I do agree that it is a closer race and it will be decided by less than what 2020 was decided by, Democrats aren't exactly in a position where they're on track to lose this race compared to where they were a month ago. A month ago, Joe Biden dropped out of the race. He decided to leave, and Kamala Harris stepped in as the presumptive Democratic nominee. 2 days later, won the committed delegates last night. The roll call confirmed. She is the nominee for President of the United States. And it didn't look that good for Democrats. And I can imagine if we were under Joe Biden right now as the presidential nominee, this Alaska primary probably have Mary Peltola at 46, 47. She probably would win in November because she's the most popular politician in Alaska right now. But it would still have been far closer. But 50.4% is so incredibly impressive because even at the height of her record-breaking approval in 2022, she couldn't even clear that. And that's not to say at all a knock on her because it brought her very close to victory. But what it did show was that in a massive uptick in terms of approval and likeness across the state, now she's doing even better. And if Democrats can actually replicate what happened in 2022, that's actually good news for Democrats on the national level. Because the nationalized Senate races, with Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania receiving support and attention from people like Donald Trump. Donald Trump visited Pennsylvania, he visited Wisconsin, he visited Georgia, he visited Arizona, he visited Nevada, he visited North Carolina. He did everything he thought he needed to do to help these Republicans win, and they lost in their races. North Carolina was 3 points narrower than what the polls were saying, even though Democrats invested $0 in the race from the national level. Sherry Beasley was on her own in North Carolina's Senate race. Democrats gave up the Wisconsin Senate race when Ron Johnson was running against Mandela Barnes. They focused their efforts elsewhere. Reasonably, based on what the polls were saying, sure, but based on what the special election and the actual election results were saying. When I say actual election, I mean results of elections that were held before November that weren't forced elections or filling a vacancy. These are regularly scheduled elections. You're talking municipality elections, turnouts in primaries, partisan primaries like the one we saw in Alaska. All in all, what we found here is that right now, the Democratic Party, if they were to replicate 2022, would actually have a pathway to victory. And the fact is, Democrats are doing better nationally than where they were in 2022. And the results from these special elections reveal that. And Alaska's primary, again, reaffirms my point that Democrats are in a position where they can win this election this coming November. And I think it's not really been lost on us for the past month that Kamala Harris does, in fact, have a shot. And I never believed that either political party should ever get complacent because I think the Republican Party really did for the past 6 months, working under this assumption that Donald Trump is going to win no matter what, that no matter who he chose, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Doug Burgum, hell, someone out of nowhere like Sarah Huckabee Sanders, he could still win the election. For Donald Trump, this past 6 months before Biden dropped out was about leaving a legacy for MAGA, winning this election by the massive margins that he's always hoped for and never achieved. And yet, this Alaska primary, alongside many other election results this year, serves as a wake-up call that Republicans will continue to refuse to answer. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.